The Sea Lady by H. G. Wells. Chapter 5. The Absence and Return of Mr. Harry Chatteris. 1. These digressions about Parker and the journalist have certainly led me astray from the story a little. You will, however, understand that while the rising young journalist was still in pursuit of information, Hope and Banghurst and Parker merely a budding perfection, the carriage not even thought of, things were already developing in that bright little establishment beneath the evergreen oaks on the Folkestone Riviera. So soon as the minds of the Buntings ceased to be altogether focused upon this new and amazing social addition they, of all people, had most indisputably discovered, it became at first faintly and then very clearly evident that their own simple pleasure in the possession of a guest so beautiful as Miss Waters, so solidly wealthy and, in a manner, so distinguished, was not entirely shared by the two young ladies who were to have been their principal guests for the season. This little rift was perceptible the very first time Mrs. Bunting had an opportunity of talking over her new arrangements with Miss Glendower. "And is she really going to stay with you all the summer?" said Adeline. "Surely, dear, you don't mind?" "It takes me a little by surprise." "She's asked me, my dear. I'm thinking of Harry. If the general election comes on in September, and everyone seems to think it will, you promised you would let us inundate you with electioneering. But do you think she will be dreadfully in the way?" She added after an interval, "She stops my working." "But, my dear—" "She's out of harmony," said Adeline. Mrs. Bunting looked out of her window at the tamarisk and the sea. "I'm sure I wouldn't do anything to hurt Harry's prospects. You know how enthusiastic we all are. Randolph would do anything. But are you sure she will be in the way? What else can she be? She might help, even." "Help?" "She might canvass. She's very attractive, you know, dear." "Not to me," said Miss Glendower. "I don't trust her." "But to some people. And as Harry says, at election times every one who can do anything must be let do it. Cut them, do anything afterwards, but at the time. You know he talked of it when Mr. Fison and he were here. If you left electioneering only to the really nice people—" "It was Mr. Fison said that, not Harry. And besides, she wouldn't help." "I think you misjudge her there, dear. She has been asking." "To help?" "Yes, and all about it," said Mrs. Bunting, with a transient pink. "She keeps asking questions about why we are having the election, and what it's all about, and why Harry is a candidate, and all that. She wants to go into it quite deeply. I can't answer half the things she asks." "And that's why she keeps up those long conversations with Mr. Melville, I suppose, and why Fred goes about neglecting Mabel." "My dear!" said Mrs. Bunting. "I wouldn't have her canvassing with us for anything," said Miss Glendower. "She'd spoil everything. She is frivolous and satirical. She looks at you with incredulous eyes, and seems to blight all one's earnestness. I don't think you quite understand, dear Mrs. Bunting, what this election and my studies mean to me. And Harry. She comes across all that like a contradiction." "Surely, my dear, I've never heard her contradict." "Oh, she doesn't contradict. But there is something about her. One feels that things that are most important and vital are nothing to her. Don't you feel it? She comes from another world to us." Mrs. Bunting remained judicial. Adeline dropped to a lower key again. "I think," she said, "anyhow, that we're taking her very easily. How do we know what she is? Down there, out there, she may be anything. She may have had excellent reasons for coming to Lan." "My dear," cried Mrs. Bunting, "is that charity? How do they live? If she hadn't lived nicely, I'm sure she couldn't behave so nicely. Besides, coming here, she had no invitation." "I've invited her now," said Mrs. Bunting gently. "You could hardly help yourself. I only hope your kindness—" "It's not a kindness," said Mrs. Bunting. "It's a duty. If she were only half as charming as she is. You seem to forget," her voice dropped, "what it is she comes for. That's what I want to know. I'm sure in these days, with so much materialism about, and such wickedness everywhere, when everybody who has a soul seems trying to lose it, to find any one who hadn't a soul and who is trying to find one. But is she trying to get one? Mr. Flange comes twice every week. He would come oftener, as you know, but if there wasn't so much confirmation about. And when he comes he sits and touches her hand if he can, and he talks in his lowest voice, and she sits and smiles. She almost laughs outright at the things he says. Because he has to win his way with her. Surely Mr. Flange may do what he can to make religion attractive. I don't believe she believes she will get a soul. I don't believe she wants one a bit." She turned towards the door as if she had done. Mrs. Bunting's pink was now permanent. She had brought up a son and 2 daughters, and besides she had brought down a husband to— my dear, how was I to know? And when it was necessary to be firm, even with Adeline Glendower, she knew how to be firm just as well as anybody. "My dear," she began, in her very firmest, quiet manner, "I am positive you misjudge Miss Waters. Trivial she may be, on the surface at any rate. Perhaps she laughs and makes fun a little. There are different ways of looking at things. But I am sure that at bottom she is just as serious, just as grave, as any one. You judge her hastily. I am sure if you knew her better, as I do—" Mrs. Bunting left an eloquent pause. Miss Glendower had 2 little pink flushes in her cheeks. She turned with her hand on the door. "At any rate," she said, "I am sure that Harry will agree with me that she can be no help to our cause. We have our work to do, and it is something more than just vulgar electioneering. We have to develop and establish ideas. Harry has views that are new and wide-reaching. We want to put our whole strength into this work, now especially, and her presence—" she paused for a moment. "It is a digression. She divides things. She puts it all wrong. She has a way of concentrating attention about herself. She alters the value of things. She prevents my being single-minded. She will prevent Harry being single-minded. I think, my dear, that you might trust my judgment a little," said Mrs. Bunting, and paused. Miss Glendower opened her mouth and shut it again, without speaking. It became evident finality was attained. Nothing remained to be said but the regrettable. The door opened and closed smartly, and Mrs. Bunting was alone. Within an hour they all met at the luncheon-table, and Adeline's behaviour to the sea lady and to Mrs. Bunting was as pleasant and alert as any highly earnest and intellectual young lady's could be. And all that Mrs. Bunting said and did tended with what people call infinite tact, which really, you know, means a great deal more tact than is comfortable, to develop and expose the more serious aspect of the sea lady's mind. Mr. Bunting was unusually talkative, and told them all about a glorious project he had just heard of, to cut out the rather shrubby and weedy front of the Leas and stick in something between a wine-vault and the Crystal Palace as a winter garden, which seemed to him a very excellent idea indeed. 2. It is time now to give some impression of the imminent Chatteris, who, for all his late appearance, is really the chief human being in my cousin Melville's story. It happens that I met him with some frequency in my university days, and afterwards ever and again I came upon him. He was rather a brilliant man at the university, smart without being vulgar, and clever for all that. He was remarkably good-looking from the very onset of his manhood, and without being in any way a showy spendthrift, was quite magnificently extravagant. There was trouble in his last year, something hushed up about a girl or woman in London, but his family had it all over with him, and his uncle, the Earl of Beechcroft, settled some of his bills. Not all, for the family is commendably free from sentimental excesses, but enough to make him comfortable again. The family is not a rich one, and it further abounds in an extraordinary quantity of rather frowsy, loose-tongued aunts. I never knew a family quite so rich in old aunts. But Chatteris was so good-looking, easy-mannered, and clever, that they seemed to agree almost without discussion to pull him through. They hunted about for something that would be really remunerative without being laborious or too commercial, and meanwhile, after the extraordinary craving of his aunt, Lady Poynting Mallow, to see him acting had been overcome by the united efforts of the more religious section of his aunts, Chatteris set himself seriously to the higher journalism. That is to say, the journalism that dines anywhere, gets political tips after dinner, and is always acceptable, if only to avoid 13 articles, in a half-crown review. In addition, he wrote some very passable verse, and edited Jane Austen for the only publisher who had not already reprinted the works of that classic lady. His verse, like himself, was shapely and handsome, and, like his face, it suggested to the penetrating eye certain reservations and indecisions. There was just that touch of refinement that is weakness in the public man, but as yet he was not a public man. He was known to be energetic, and his work was gathering attention as always capable and occasionally brilliant. His aunts declared he was ripening, that any defect in vigor he displayed was the incompleteness of the process, and decided he should go to America, where vigor and vigorous opportunities abound. And there, I gather, he came upon something like a failure. Something happened. Indeed, quite a lot happened. He came back unmarried, and via the South Seas, Australasia, and India. And Lady Poynting Mallow publicly told him he was a fool when he got back. What happened in America, even if one does not consult contemporary American papers, is still very difficult to determine. There appeared to have been the daughter of a millionaire, and something like an engagement in the story, according to the New York Yell, one of the smartest, crispest, and altogether more representative papers in America. There was also the daughter of someone else, whom the Yell interviewed, or professed to interview, under the heading, "An aristocratic Britisher trifles with a pure American girl. Interview with the victim of his heartless levity." But this someone else was, I am inclined to think, in spite of her excellently executed portrait, merely a brilliant stroke of modern journalism. The Yell having got wind of the sudden retreat of Chatteris, and inventing a reason in preference to discovering one. Wensleydale tells me the true impetus to bolt was the merest trifle. The daughter of the millionaire, being a bright and spirited girl, had undergone interviewing on the subject of her approaching marriage, on marriage in general, on social questions of various sorts, and on the relations of the British and American peoples. And he seems to have found the thing in his morning paper. It took him suddenly, and he lost his head. And once he started, he seems to have lacked the power of mind to turn about and come back. The affair was a mess. The family paid some more of his bills, and shirked others. And Chatteris turned up in London again, after a time, with somewhat diminished glory and a series of letters on imperial affairs, each headed with the quotation, "What do they know of England who only England know?" Of course, people of England learnt nothing of the real circumstances of the case, but it was fairly obvious that he had gone to America and come back empty-handed. And that was how, in the course of some years, he came to Adeline Glendower, of whose special gifts as his helper and inspiration you have already heard from Mrs. Bunting. When he became engaged to her, the family, which had long craved to forgive him, Lady Poynting Mallow, as a matter of fact, had done so, brightened wonderfully. And after a considerable obscure activities, he declared himself a philanthropic Liberal, with open spaces in his platform, and in a position, and ready as a beginning, to try the quality of the Conservative South. He was away making certain decisive arrangements in Paris and elsewhere at the time of the landing of the Sea Lady. Before the matter was finally settled, it was necessary that something should be said to a certain great public character, and then he was to return and tell Adeline. And everyone was expecting him daily, including, it is now indisputable, the Sea Lady. 3. The meeting of Miss Glendower and her affianced lover on his return from Paris was one of those scenes in this story for which I have scarcely an inkling of the true details. He came to Folkestone and stopped at the Metropole, the Bunting house being full, and the Metropole being the nearest hotel to Sandgate, and he walked down in the afternoon and asked for Adeline, which was pretty rather than correct. I gather that they met in the drawing-room, and as Chatteris closed the door behind him, I imagine there was something in the nature of a caress. I must confess I envy the freedom of the novelist who can take you behind such a locked door as this, and give you all that such persons say and do. But with the strongest will in the world to blend the little scraps of fact I have into a continuous sequence of events, I falter at this occasion. After all, I never saw Adeline at all until after all these things were over. And what is she now? A rather tall, a rather restless and active woman, very keen and obvious in public affairs, with something gone out of her. Melville once saw a gleam of that, but for the most part Melville never liked her. She had a wider grasp of things than he, and he was a little afraid of her. She was, in some inexplicable way, neither a pretty woman nor a dear lady, nor a grande dame, nor totally insignificant, and a heretic, therefore, in Melville's scheme of things. He gives me small material for that earlier Adeline. She posed, he says. She was political, and she was always reading Mrs. Humphrey Ward. The last Melville regarded as the most heinous offence. It is not the least of my cousin's weaknesses that he regards this great novelist as an extremely corrupting influence for intelligent girls. She makes them good and serious in the wrong way, he says. Adeline, he asserts, was absolutely built on her. She was always attempting to be the incarnation of Marcella. It was he who had perverted Mrs. Bunting's mind to adopt this fancy. But I don't believe for a moment in this idea of girls building themselves on heroines in fiction. These are matters of elective affinity, and unless some bullying critic or preacher sends us astray, we take each to our own novelist, as the souls in the Swedenborgian system take to their hells. Adeline took to the imaginary Marcella. There was, Melville says, the strongest likeness in their mental atmosphere. They had the same defects, a bias for superiority, to use his expressive phrase, the same disposition towards arrogant benevolence, that same obtuseness to little shades of feeling that leads people to speak habitually of the lower classes, and to think in the vein of that phrase. They certainly had the same virtues, a conscious and conscientious integrity, a hard nobility without one touch of magic, an industrious thoroughness. More than in anything else, Adeline delighted in her novelist's thoroughness, her freedom from impressionism, the patient resolution with which she went into the corners and swept under the mat of every incident. And it would be easy to argue from that Adeline behaved as Mrs. Ward's most characteristic heroine behaved, on an analogous occasion. Marcella, we know, at least after her heart was changed, would have clung to him. There would have been a moment of high emotion, in which thoughts, of the highest class, mingled with the natural ambition of two people in the prime of life and power. Then she would have receded with a quick movement, and listened with her beautiful hand pensive against her cheek, while Chatteris began to sum up the forces against him, to speculate on the action of this group and that. Something infinitely tender and maternal would have spoken in her, pledging her to the utmost help that love and a woman can give. She would have produced in Chatteris that exquisite mingled impression of grace, passion, self-yielding, which in all its infinite variations and repetitions made up for him the constant poem of her beauty. But that is the dream and not the reality. So Adeline might have dreamt of behaving, but she was not Marcella, and only wanting to be. And he was not only not Maxwell, but he had no intention of being Maxwell anyhow. If he had had an opportunity of becoming Maxwell, he would probably have rejected it with extreme incivility. So they met like two unheroic human beings, with shy and clumsy movements, and, I suppose, fairly honest eyes. Something there was in the nature of a caress, I believe. And then I inclined to fancy she said, "Well?" and I think he must have answered, "It's all right." After that, and rather elusively, with a backward jerk of the head at intervals, as it were towards the great personage, Chatteris must have told her the particulars. He must have told her that he was going to contest Hythe, and that the little difficulty with the Glasgow commission agent, who wanted to run the Radical ticket as a man of Kent, had been settled without injury to the party, such as it is. Assuredly they talked politics, because soon after, when they came into the garden side by side to where Mrs. Bunting and the sea-lady sat watching the girls play croquet, Adeline was in full possession of all these facts. I fancy that for such a couple as they were, such intimation of success, such earnest topics, replaced, to a certain extent at any rate, the vain repetition of vulgar endearments. The sea-lady appears to have been the first to see them. "Here he is," she said abruptly. "Whom?" said Mrs. Bunting, glancing up at eyes that were suddenly eager, and then following their glance towards Chatteris. "Your other son," said the sea-lady, jesting unheeded. "It's Harry and Adeline!" cried Mrs. Bunting. "Don't they make a handsome couple?" But the sea-lady made no reply, and leaned back, scrutinizing their advance. Certainly they made a handsome pair, coming out of the verandah into the blaze of the sun, and across the trim lawn towards the shadow of the ilex trees, they were lit, as it were, with a more glorious limelight, and displayed like actors on a stage more spacious than the stage of any theatre. The figure of Chatteris must have come out tall and fair and broad, a little sunburnt, and I gather even then a little preoccupied, as indeed he always seemed to be in those latter days. And beside him, Adeline, glancing now up at him and now towards the audience under the trees, dark and a little flushed, rather tall, though not so tall as Marcella seems to have been, and, you know, without any instructions from any novel writer in the world, glad. Chatteris did not discover that there was any one but Buntings under the tree until he was close at hand. Then the abrupt discovery of this stranger seems to have checked whatever he was prepared to say for his début, and Adeline took the centre of the stage. Mrs. Bunting was standing up, and all the croquet players, except Mabel, who was winning, converged on Chatteris with cries of welcome. Mabel remained in the midst of what I understand is called a tea-party, loudly demanding that they should see her play it out. No doubt if everything had gone well she would have given a most edifying exhibition of what croquet can sometimes be. Adeline swam forward to Mrs. Bunting and cried with a note of triumph in her voice, "It is all settled. Everything is settled. He has won them all, and he is to contest Hythe." Quite involuntarily her eyes must have met the sea lady's. It is of course quite impossible to say what she found there, or indeed what there was to find there, then. For a moment they faced riddles, and then the sea lady turned her eyes with a long deferred scrutiny to the man's face, which she probably saw now closely for the first time. One wonders whether it is just possible that there may have been something, if it were no more than a gleam of surprise and enquiry, in that meeting of their eyes. Just for a moment she held his regard, and then it shifted enquiringly to Mrs. Bunting. That lady intervened effusively with an "Oh, I forgot!" and introduced them. I think they went through that without another meeting of the foils of their regard. "You back?" said Fred to Chatteris, touching his arm, and Chatteris confirmed this happy guess. The Bunting girls seemed to welcome Adeline's enviable situation rather than Chatteris as an individual, and Mabel's voice could be heard approaching. "Oughtn't they to see me play it out, Mr. Chatteris?" "Hullo, Harry, my boy!" cried Mr. Bunting, who was cultivating a bluff manner. "How's Paris?" "How's the fishing?" said Harry. And so they came into a vague circle about this lively person who had won them all, except Parker, of course, who remained in her own proper place, and was, I am certain, never to be won by anybody. There was a handing and shifting of garden chairs. No one seemed to take the slightest notice of Adeline's dramatic announcement. The Buntings were not good at thinking of things to say. She stood in the midst of the group like a leading lady when the other actors have forgotten their parts. Then every one woke up to this, as it were, and they went off in a volley. "So it's really all settled," said Mrs. Bunting, and Betty Bunting said, "There is to be an election, then?" and Nettie said, "What fun!" Mr. Bunting remarked with a knowing air, "So you saw him, then?" and Fred flung "Hooray!" into the tangle of sounds. The sea lady, of course, said nothing. "We'll give 'em a jolly good fight for it, anyhow," said Mr. Bunting. "Well, I hope we shall do that," said Chatteris. "We shall do more than that," said Adeline. "If they had any sense," said Mr. Bunting. Then came a pause, and Mr. Bunting was emboldened to lift up his voice and utter politics. "They are getting sense," he said. "They are learning that a party must have men of birth and training. Money and the mob, they've tried to keep things going by playing to fads and class jealousies. And the Irish. And they've had their lesson. How? Why, we've stood aside. We've left 'em to faddists and fermenters. And the Irish. And here they are. It's a revolution in the party. We've let it down. Now we must pick it up again." He made a gesture with his fat little hand, one of those fat pink little hands that appear to have neither flesh nor bones inside them, but only sawdust or horsehair. Mrs. Bunting leaned back in her chair and smiled at him indulgently. "It's no common election," said Mr. Bunting. "It is a great issue." The sea lady had been regarding him thoughtfully. "What is a great issue?" she asked. "I don't quite understand." Mr. Bunting spread himself to explain to her. "This," he said, to begin with. Adeline listened with a mingling of interest and impatience, attempting ever and again to suppress him, and to involve Chatteris by a tactful interposition. But Chatteris appeared disinclined to be involved. He seemed indeed quite interested in Mr. Bunting's view of the case. Presently the croquet quartet went back, at Mabel's suggestion, to their game, and the others continued their political talk. It became more personal at last, dealing soon quite specifically with all that Chatteris was doing, and more particularly all that Chatteris was to do. Mrs. Bunting suddenly suppressed Mr. Bunting as he was offering advice, and Adeline took the burden of the talk again. She indicated vast purposes. "This election is merely the opening of a door," she said. When Chatteris made modest disavowals, she smiled with a proud and happy consciousness of what she meant to make of him, and Mrs. Bunting supplied footnotes to make it all clear to the sea lady. "He's so modest," she said at one point, and Chatteris pretended not to hear, and went rather pink. Ever and again he attempted to deflect the talk towards the sea lady and away from himself, but he was hampered by his ignorance of her position, and the sea lady said scarcely anything, but watched Chatteris and Adeline, and more particularly Chatteris in relation to Adeline. Chapter 5. Recording by Tony Foster. The Sea Lady, by H. G. Wells. Chapter 6. My cousin Melville is never very clear about his dates. Now this is greatly to be regretted, because it would be very illuminating indeed if one could tell just how many days elapsed before he came upon Chatteris in intimate conversation with the sea lady. He was going along the front of the Leas with some books from the public library that Miss Glendower had suddenly wished to consult, and which she, with that entire ignorance of his lack of admiration for her which was part of her want of charm for him, had bidden him bring her. It was in one of those sheltered paths just under the brow which give such a pleasant and characteristic charm to Folkestone, that he came upon a little group about the sea lady's bath-chair. Chatteris was seated in one of the wooden seats that are embedded in the bank, and was leaning forward and looking into the sea lady's face, and she was speaking with a smile that struck Melville even at the time as being a little special in its quality. And she seems to have been capable of many charming smiles. Parker was a little distance away, where a sort of bastion projects and gives a wide view of the pier and harbour and the coast of France, regarding it all with a qualified disfavour, and the bath-chairman was crumpled up against the bank, lost in that wistful melancholy that the constant perambulation of broken humanity necessarily engenders. My cousin slackened his pace a little and came up and joined them. The conversation hung at his approach. Chatteris sat back a little, but there seemed no resentment, and he sought a topic for the three to discuss in the books Melville carried. "Books?" he said. "For Miss Glendower," said Melville. "Oh," said Chatteris. "What are they about?" asked the sea lady. "Land tenure," said Melville. "That's hardly my subject," said the sea lady, and Chatteris joined in her smile as if he saw a jest. There was a little pause. "You are contesting Hythe," said Melville. "Fate points that way," said Chatteris. "They threaten a dissolution for September." "It will come in a month," said Chatteris, with the inimitable tone of one who knows. "In that case we shall soon be busy." "And I may canvass," said the sea lady. "I never have." "Miss Waters," explained Chatteris, "has been telling me she means to help us." He met Melville's eye frankly. "It's rough work, Miss Waters," said Melville. "I don't mind that. It's fun, and I want to help. I really do want to help, Mr. Chatteris. You know, that's encouraging. I could go around with you in my bath-chair." "It would be a picnic," said Chatteris. "I mean to help anyhow," said the sea lady. "You know the case for the plaintiff?" asked Melville. She looked at him. "You've got your arguments?" "I shall ask them to vote for Mr. Chatteris, and afterwards, when I see them, I shall remember them, and smile and wave my hand. What else is there?" "Nothing," said Chatteris, and shut the lid on Melville. "I wish I had an argument as good." "What sort of people are they here?" asked Melville. Isn't there a smuggling interest to conciliate?" "I haven't asked that," said Chatteris. "Smuggling is over and past, you know. 40 years ago. It always has been 40 years ago. They trotted out the last of the smugglers, interesting old man, full of reminiscences, when there was a Count of the Saxon shore. He remembered smuggling 40 years ago. Really, I doubt if there ever was any smuggling. The existing coastguard is a sacrifice to a vain superstition." "Why," cried the sea lady, "only about 5 weeks ago I saw quite near here—" She stopped abruptly and caught Melville's eye. He grasped her difficulty. "In a paper?" he suggested. "Yes, in a paper," she said, seizing the rope he threw her. "Well?" asked Chatteris. "There is smuggling still," said the sea lady, with an air of someone who decides not to tell an anecdote that is suddenly found to be half forgotten. "There's no doubt it happens," said Chatteris, missing it all. "But it doesn't appear in the electioneering. I certainly shan't agitate for a faster revenue cutter. However things may be in that respect, I take the line that they are very well as they are. That's my line, of course." And he looked out to sea. The eyes of Melville and the sea lady had an intimate moment. "There, you know, is just a specimen of the sort of thing we do," said Chatteris. "Are you prepared to be as intricate as that?" "Quite," said the sea lady. My cousin was reminded of an anecdote. The talk degenerated into anecdotes of canvassing, and ran shallow. My cousin was just gathering that Mrs. Bunting and Miss Bunting had been with the sea lady, and had gone into the town to a shop, when they returned. Chatteris rose to greet them, and explained, what had been by no means apparent before, that he was on his way to Adeline, and after a few further trivialities he and Melville went on together. A brief silence fell between them. "Who is that Miss Waters?" asked Chatteris. "Friend of Mrs. Bunting," prevaricated Melville. "So I gather. She seems a very charming person." "She is." "She's interesting. Her illness seems to throw her up. It makes a passive thing of her, like a picture or something that's imaginary. Imagined, anyhow. She sits there and smiles and responds. Her eyes have something intimate. And yet—" My cousin offered no assistance. "Where did Mrs. Bunting find her?" My cousin had to gather himself together for a second or so. "There's something," he said deliberately, "that Mrs. Bunting doesn't seem disposed—" "What can it be?" "It's bound to be all right," said Melville, rather weakly. "It's strange, too. Mrs. Bunting is usually so disposed." Melville left that to itself. "That's what one feels," said Chatteris. "What?" "Mystery. My cousin shares with me a profound detestation of that high mystic method of treating women. He likes women to be finite and nice. In fact, he likes everything to be finite and nice. So he merely grunted. But Chatteris was not to be stopped by that. He passed to a critical note. "No doubt it's all illusion. All women are impressionists. A patch, a light, you get an effect. And that is all you're meant to get, I suppose. She gets an effect. But how? That's the mystery. It's not merely beauty. There's plenty of beauty in the world, but not of these effects. The eyes, I fancy." He dwelt on that for a moment. "There's really nothing in eyes, you know, Chatteris," said my cousin Melville, borrowing an alien argument and a tone of analytical cynicism from me. "Have you ever looked at eyes through a hole in a sheet?" "Oh, I don't know," said Chatteris. "I don't mean the mere physical eye. Perhaps it's the look of health. And the bath-chair. A bold discord. You don't know what's the matter, Melville?" "How?" "I gather from Bunting it's a disablement, not a deformity." "He ought to know." "I'm not so sure of that. You don't happen to know the nature of her disablement?" "I can't tell at all," said Melville, in a speculative tone. It struck him he was getting to prevaricate better. The subject seemed exhausted. They spoke of a common friend whom the sight of the Metropole suggested. Then they did not talk at all for a time, until the stir and interest of the band-stand was past. Then Chatteris threw out a thought. "Complex business. Feminine motives," he remarked. "How?" "This canvassing. She can't be interested in philanthropic liberalism. There's a difference in the type. And besides, it's a personal matter." "Not necessarily, is it? Surely there's not such an intellectual gap between the sexes? If you can get interested—" "Oh, I know. Besides, it's not a question of principles. It's the fun of electioneering." "Fun!" "There's no knowing what won't interest the feminine mind," said Melville, and added, "or what will." Chatteris did not answer. "It's the district visiting instinct, I suppose," said Melville. "They all have it. It's the canvassing. All women like to go into houses that don't belong to them." "Very likely," said Chatteris shortly, and failing a reply from Melville, he gave way to secret meditations. It would seem still of a fairly agreeable sort. The 12 o'clock gun thudded from Shorncliffe camp. "By Jove!" said Chatteris, and quickened his steps. They found Adeline busy amidst her papers. As they entered she pointed reproachfully, yet with the protrusion of a certain Marcella-like undertone of sweetness, at the clock. The apologies of Chatteris were effusive and winning, and involved no mention of the sea lady on the lees. Melville delivered his books and left them, already wading deeply into the details of the district organization that the local Liberal organizer had submitted. 2. A little while after the return of Chatteris, my cousin Melville and the sea lady were under the ilex at the end of the sea garden, and, disregarding Parker, as every one was accustomed to do, who was in the garden chair doing some afternoon work at a proper distance, there was nobody with them at all. Fred and the girls were out cycling. Fred had gone with them at the sea lady's request, and Miss Glendower and Mrs. Bunting were at Hythe, calling diplomatically on some rather horrid local people who might be serviceable to Harry in his electioneering. Mr. Bunting was out fishing. He was not fond of fishing, but he was in many respects an exceptionally resolute little man, and he had taken to fishing every day in the afternoon, after luncheon, in order to break himself of what Mrs. Bunting called his ridiculous habit of getting seasick whenever he went out in a boat. He said that if fishing from a boat with pieces of mussels for bait after luncheon would not break the habit, nothing would, and certainly it seemed at times as if it were going to break everything that was in him. But the habit escaped. This, however, is a digression. These two, I say, were sitting in the ample shade under the evergreen oak, and Melville, I imagine, was in those fine, faintly patterned flannels that in the year 1899 combined correctness with ease. He was no doubt looking at the shaded face of the sea lady, framed in a frame of sunlit yellow-green lawn and black-green ilex leaves. At least so my impulse for verisimilitude conceives it. And she at first was pensive and downcast that afternoon, and afterwards she was interested and looked into his eyes. Either she must have suggested that he might smoke, or else he asked. Anyhow, his cigarettes were produced. She looked at them with an arrested gesture, and he hung for a moment, doubtful, on her gesture. "I suppose you—" he said. "I never learned." He glanced at Parker and then met the sea lady's regard. "It's one of the things I came for," she said. He took the only course. She accepted a cigarette and examined it thoughtfully. "Down there," she said, "it's just one of the things. You will understand, we get nothing but saturated tobacco. Some of the mermen, there's something they have picked up from the sailors, quids, I think they call it, but that's too horrid for words." She dismissed the unpleasant topic by a movement, and lapsed into thought. My cousin clicked his matchbox. She had a momentary doubt, and glanced towards the house. "Mrs. Bunting?" she asked. Several times, I understand, she asked the same thing. "She wouldn't mind," said Melville, and stopped. "She won't think it improper," he amplified, "if nobody else thinks it's improper." "There's nobody else," said the sea lady, glancing at Parker, and my cousin lit the match. My cousin has an indirect habit of mind. With all general and all personal things, his desperation to get at them obliquely amounts almost to a passion. He could no more go straight to a crisis than a cat could to a stranger. He came off at a tangent now as he was sitting forward and scrutinizing her first very creditable efforts to draw. "I just wonder," he said, "exactly what it was you did come for." She smiled at him over a little jet of smoke. "Why, this," she said. "And hairdressing." "And dressing." She smiled again after a momentary hesitation. "And all this sort of thing," she said. as if she felt she had answered him perhaps a little below his deserts. Her gesture indicated the house and the lawn, and my cousin Melville wondered just exactly how much else. "Am I doing it right?" asked the sea lady. "Beautifully," said my cousin, with a faint sigh in his voice. "What do you think of it?" "It was worth coming for," said the sea lady, smiling into his eyes. "But did you really just come?" She filled in his gap. "To see what life was like on land here? Isn't that enough?" Melville's cigarette had failed to light. He regarded its blighted career pensively. "Life," he said, "isn't all this sort of thing." "This sort of thing?" "Sunlight, cigarette smoking, talk, looking nice." "But it's made up." "Not altogether." "For example?" "Oh, you know." "What?" "You know," said Melville, and would not look at her. "I decline to know," she said, after a little pause. "Besides," he said. "Yes?" "You told Mrs. Bunting—" It occurred to him that he was telling tales, but that scruple came too late. "Well?" "Something about a soul." She made no immediate answer. He looked up, and her eyes were smiling. "Mr. Melville," she said, innocently, "what is a soul?" "Well?" said my cousin readily, and then paused for a space. "A soul," said he, and knocked an imaginary ash from his extinct cigarette. "A soul," he repeated, and glanced at Parker. "A soul, you know," he said again, and looked at the sea lady with the air of a man who is handling a difficult matter with skilful care. "Come to think of it," he said, "it's a rather complicated matter to explain." "To a being without one?" "To any one," said my cousin Melville, suddenly admitting his difficulty. He meditated upon her eyes for a moment. "Besides," he said, "you know what a soul is perfectly well." "No," she answered, "I don't." "You know as well as I do." "Ah, that may be different." "You came to get a soul?" "Perhaps I don't want one." "Why, if one hasn't one—" "Ah, there!" and my cousin shrugged his shoulders. "But really, you know, it's just the generality of it that makes it hard to define." "Everybody has a soul?" "Every one." "Except me." "I'm not certain of that." "Mrs. Bunting?" "Certainly." "And Mr. Bunting?" "Every one." "Has Miss Glendower?" "Lots." The sea lady mused. She went off at a tangent abruptly. "Mr. Melville," she said, "what is a union of souls?" Melville flicked his extinct cigarette suddenly into an elbow shape and then threw it away. The phrase may have awakened some reminiscence. "It's an extra," he said. "It's a sort of flourish. And sometimes it's like leaving cards by footmen. A substitute for the real presence." There came a gap. He remained downcast, trying to find a way towards whatever it was that was in his mind to say. Conceivably, he did not clearly know what that might be until he came to it. The sea lady abandoned an attempt to understand him in favor of a more urgent topic. "Do you think Miss Glendower and Mr. Chatteris—" Melville looked up at her. He noticed she had hung on the latter name. "Decidedly," he said, "it's just what they would do." Then he spoke again. "Chatteris," he said. "Yes," said she. "I thought so," said Melville. The sea lady regarded him gravely. They scrutinized each other with an unprecedented intimacy. Melville was suddenly direct. It was a discovery that it seemed he ought to have made all along. He felt quite unaccountably bitter. He spoke with a twitch of the mouth, and his voice had a note of accusation. "You want to talk about him?" She nodded, still grave. "Well, I don't." He changed his note. "But I will if you wish it." "I thought you would." "Oh, you know," said Melville, discovering his extinct cigarette was within reach of a vindictive heel. She said nothing. "Well?" said Melville. "I saw him first," she apologized, "some years ago." "Where?" "In the South Seas, near Tonga." "And that is really what you came for?" This time her manner was convincing. She admitted, "Yes." Melville was carefully impartial. "He's sightly," he admitted, "and well built, and a decent chap." "A decent chap? But I don't see why you—" he went off at a tangent. "He didn't see you." "Oh, no." Melville's pose and tone suggested a mind of extreme liberality. "I don't see why you came," he said, "nor what you mean to do. You see," with an air of noting a trifling but valid obstacle, "there's Miss Glendower." "Is there?" she said. "Well, isn't there?" "That's just it," she said. "And besides, after all, you know, why should you—" "I admit it's unreasonable," she said. "But why reason about it? It's a matter of the imagination. For him? How should I know how it takes him? That is what I want to know." Melville looked her in the eyes again. "You know, you're not playing fair," he said. "To her?" "To anyone." "Why?" "Because you are immortal, and unencumbered. Because you can do everything you want to do, and we cannot. I don't know why we cannot, but we cannot. Here we are with our short lives and our little souls to save or lose, fussing for our little concerns, and you, out of the elements, come and beckon. The elements have their rights," he said, and then, "The elements are the elements, you know. That is what you forget." "Imagination? Certainly. That's the element. Those elements of your chemists, yes, they're all imagination. There isn't any other," she went on. "And all the elements of your life, the life you imagine you are living, the little things you must do, the little cares, the extraordinary little duties, the day by day, the hypnotic limitations, all these are a fancy that has taken hold of you too strongly for you to shake off. You daren't, you mustn't, you can't. To us who watch you, you watch us? Oh, yes, we watch you, and sometimes we envy you, not only for the dry air and the sunlight and the shadows of trees and the feeling of morning and the pleasantness of many such things, but because your lives begin and end, because you look towards an end." She reverted to her former topic. "But you are so limited, so tied. The little time you have, that you use so poorly. You begin and you end, and all the time between it's as if you were enchanted. You are afraid to do this that would be delightful to do. You must do that, though you know all the time it is stupid and disagreeable. Just think of the things, even the little things, you mustn't do. Up there on the leas in this hot weather all the people are sitting in stuffy, ugly clothes, ever so much too much, and they are all with little to talk about and nothing to look at, and bound not to do all sorts of natural things, and bound to do all sorts of preposterous things. Why are they bound? Why are they letting life slip by them? Just as if they wouldn't all of them presently be dead. Suppose you were to go up there in a bathing dress and a white cotton hat." "It wouldn't be proper," cried Melville. "Why not?" "It would be outrageous." "But anyone may see you like that on the beach." "That's different." "It isn't different. You dream it's different. And in just the same way you dream all the other things are proper or improper or good or bad to do. Because you are in a dream, a fantastic, unwholesome little dream. So small, so infinitely small. I saw you the other day dreadfully worried by a spot of ink on your sleeve, almost the whole afternoon." My cousin looked distressed. She abandoned the ink spot. "Your life, I tell you, is a dream. A dream, and you can't wake out of it." "And if so, why do you tell me?" She made no answer for a space. "Why do you tell me?" he insisted. He heard the rustle of her movement as she bent towards him. She came warmly close to him. She spoke in gently confidential undertone, as one who imparts a secret that is not to be too lightly given. "Because," she said, "there are better dreams." End of Chapter 6, Part 1 of The Sea Lady. Read by Tony Foster. The Sea Lady, by H.G. Wells. Chapter 6, Part 2. 3. For a moment it seemed to Melville that he had been addressed by something quite other than the pleasant lady in the bath-chair before him. "But how—" he began, and stopped. He remained silent with a perplexed face. She leaned back and glanced away from him, And when at last she turned and spoke again, specific realities closed in on him once more. "Why shouldn't I?" she asked. "If I want to." "Shouldn't what?" "If I fancy Chatteris." "One might think of obstacles," he reflected. "He's not hers," she said. "In a way, he's trying to be," said Melville. "Trying to be! He has to be what he is. Nothing can make him hers. If you weren't dreaming you would see that." My cousin was silent. "She's not real," she went on. "She's a mass of fancies and vanities. She gets everything out of books. She gets herself out of a book. You can see her doing it here. What is she seeking? What is she trying to do? All this work, all this political stuff of hers. She talks of the condition of the poor. What is the condition of the poor? A dreary tossing on the bed of existence, a perpetual fear of consequences that perpetually distresses them. Lives of anxiety they lead because they do not know what a dream the whole thing is. Suppose they were not anxious and afraid. And what does she care for the condition of the poor, after all? It is only a point of departure in her dream. In her heart she does not want their dreams to be happier. In her heart she has no passion for them. Only her dream is that she should be prominently doing good, asserting herself, controlling their affairs, amidst thanks and praise and blessings. Her dream! Of serious things! A rout of phantoms pursuing a phantom ignis fatuus, the afterglow of a mirage. Vanity of vanities. It's real enough to her. As real as she can make it, you know. But she isn't real herself. She begins badly. And he, you know, he doesn't believe in it. I'm not so sure. I am, now. He's a complicated being. He will ravel out, said the sea lady. I think you misjudge him about that work of his anyhow, said Melville. He's a man rather divided against himself, he added abruptly. We all are. He recovered himself from the generality. It's vague, I admit, a sort of vague wish to do something decent, you know, that he has. A sort of vague wish, she conceded. But he means well, said Melville, clinging to his proposition. He means nothing. Only very dimly he suspects. Yes? What you too are beginning to suspect. That other things may be conceivable, even if they are not possible. That this life of yours is not everything. That it's not to be taken too seriously, because there are better dreams. The song of the sirens was in her voice. My cousin would not look at her face. I know nothing of any other dreams, he said. One has oneself and his this life, and that is enough to manage. What other dreams can there be? Anyhow, we are in the dream, we have to accept it. Besides, you know, that's going off the question. We were talking of Chatteris, and why you have come for him. Why should you come? Why should anyone outside come? Into this world? Because we are permitted to come, we immortals. And why, if we choose to do so, and taste this life that passes and continues, as rain that falls to the ground, why should we not do it? Why should we abstain? And Chatteris? If he pleases me? He roused himself to a titanic effort against an oppression that was coming over him. He tried to get the thing down to a definite small case, an incident, an affair of considerations. But look here, you know, he said, what precisely do you mean to do if you get him? You don't seriously intend to keep up the game to that extent. You don't mean, positively in our terrestrial fashion, you know, to marry him? The sea lady laughed at his recovery of the practical tone. Well, why not? She asked. And go about in a bath chair and... No, that's not it. What is it? He looked up into her eyes, and it was like looking into deep water. Down in that deep there stirred impalpable things. She smiled at him. No, she said, I shan't marry him and go about in a bath chair, and grow old as all earthly women must. It's the dust, I think, and the dryness of the air, and the way you begin and end. You burn too fast, you flare and sink and die. This life of yours, the illnesses and the growing old, when the skin wears shabby and the light is out of the hair and the teeth. Not even for love would I face it. No. But then, you know," her voice sank to a low whisper, "there are better dreams." "What dreams?" rebelled Melville. "What do you mean? What are you? What do you mean by coming into this life, you who pretend to be a woman, and whispering to us who are in it, to us who have no escape?" "But there is an escape," said the sea lady. "How?" "For some there is an escape. When the whole life rushes to a moment—" And then she stopped. Now there is clearly no sense in this sentence to my mind, even from a lady of an essentially imaginary sort, who comes out of the sea. How can a whole life rush to a moment? But whatever it was she really did say, there is no doubt she left it half unsaid. He glanced up at her abrupt pause, and she was looking at the house. "Doris! Doris! Are you there?" It was Mrs. Bunting's voice, floating athwart the lawn, the voice of the ascendant present, of invincibly sensible things. The world grew real again to Melville. He seemed to wake up, to start back from some delusive trance that crept upon him. He looked at the sea lady as if he were already incredulous of the things they had said, as if he had been asleep and dreamed the talk. Some light seemed to go out, some fancy faded. His eye rested upon the inscription, "Flamps, bath-chair proprietor," just visible under her arm. "We've got perhaps a little more serious than—" he said doubtfully, and then, "What have you been saying? Did you exactly mean—" The rustle of Mrs. Bunting's advance became audible, and Parker moved and coughed. He was quite sure they had been more serious than— Another time, perhaps. Had all these things really been said, or was he under some fantastic hallucination? He had a sudden thought. "Where's your cigarette?" he asked. But her cigarette had ended long ago. "And what have you been talking about so long?" sang Mrs. Bunting, with an almost motherly hand on the back of Melville's chair. "Oh!" said Melville, at a loss for once, and suddenly rising from his chair to face her, and then to the sea lady with an artificially easy smile. "What have we been talking about?" "All sorts of things, I dare say," said Mrs. Bunting, in what might almost be called an arch manner. And she honoured Melville with a special smile, one of those smiles that are morally almost winks. My cousin caught all the archness full in the face, and for 4 seconds he stared at Mrs. Bunting in amazement. He wanted breath. Then they all laughed together, and Mrs. Bunting sat down pleasantly and remarked, quite audibly to herself, "As if I couldn't guess." 4. I gather that after this talk Melville fell into an extraordinary net of doubting. In the first place, and what was most distressing, he doubted whether this conversation could have possibly have happened at all, and if it had, whether his memory had not played him some trick in modifying and intensifying the import of it all. My cousin occasionally dreams conversations of so sober and probable a sort as to mingle quite perplexingly with his real experiences. Was this one of these occasions? He found himself taking up and scrutinizing, as it were, first this remembered sentence and then that. Had she really said this thing quite in this way? His memory of their conversation was never quite the same for 2 days together. Had she really and deliberately foreshadowed for Chatteris some obscure and mystical submergence? What intensified and complicated his doubts most was the sea lady's subsequent serene freedom from allusion to anything that might or might not have passed. She behaved just as she had always behaved, neither an added intimacy nor that distance that follows in discreet confidences appeared in her manner. And amidst this crop of questions arose presently quite a new set of doubts, as if he were not already sufficiently equipped. The sea lady alleged she had come to the world that lives on land for Chatteris. And then? He had not hitherto looked ahead to see precisely what would happen to Chatteris, to Miss Glendower, to the Buntings, or anyone, when, as seemed highly probable, Chatteris was got. There were other dreams, there was another existence, an elsewhere, and Chatteris was to go there. So she said. But it came into Melville's mind with a quite disproportionate force and vividness that once, long ago, he had seen a picture of a man and a mermaid rushing downward through deep water. Could it possibly be that sort of thing in the year 1899? Conceivably, if she had said these things, did she mean them? And if she meant them, and this definite campaign of capture was in hand, what was an orderly, sane-living, well-dressed bachelor of the world to do? Look on, until things ended in a catastrophe? One figures his face almost aged. He appears to have hovered about the house on the Sandgate Riviera to a scandalous extent, failing always to get a sufficiently long and intimate tete-a-tete with the sea lady to settle once and for all his doubts as to what really had been said, and what he had dreamed or fancied in their talk. Never had he been so exceedingly disturbed as he was by the twist this talk had taken. Never had his habitual pose of humorous acquiescence in life been quite so difficult to keep up. He became positively absent-minded. "You know, if it's like that, it's serious," was the burden of his private mutterings. His condition was palpable, even to Mrs. Bunting. But she misunderstood his nature. She said something. Finally, and quite abruptly, he set off to London in a state of frantic determination to get out of it all. The sea lady wished him good-bye in Mrs. Bunting's presence as if there had never been anything unusual between them. I suppose one may contrive to understand something of his disturbance. He had made quite considerable sacrifices to the world. He had, at great pains, found his place and his way in it. He had imagined he had really got the hang of it, as people say, and was having an interesting time. And then, you know, to encounter a voice that subsequently insists upon haunting you with "there are better dreams," to hear a tale that threatens complications, disasters, broken hearts, and not to have the faintest idea of the proper thing to do. But I do not think he would have bolted from Sandgate until he had really got some more definite answer to the question. What better dreams? Until he had surprised or forced some clearer illumination from the passive invalid, if Mrs. Bunting one morning had not very tactfully dropped a hint. You know Mrs. Bunting, and you can imagine what she tactfully hinted. Just at that time, what with her own girls and the Glendower girls, her imagination was positively inflamed for matrimony. She was a matrimonial fanatic. She would have married anybody to anything, just for the fun of doing it. And the idea of pairing off poor Melville to this mysterious immortal with a scaly tail seems to have appeared to her the most natural thing in the world. Apropos of nothing whatever, I fancy she remarked, "Your opportunity is now, Mr. Melville." "My opportunity?" cried Melville, trying madly not to understand in the face of her pink resolution. "You've a monopoly now," she cried. "But when we go back to London with her there will be ever so many people running after her." I fancy Melville said something about carrying the thing too far. He doesn't remember what he did say. I don't think he even knew at the time. However, he fled back to London in August, and was there so miserably at loose ends that he had not the will to get out of the place. On this passage in the story he does not dwell, and such verisimilitude as may be must be supplied by my imagination. I imagine him in his charmingly appointed flat, a flat that is light without being trivial, and artistic with no want of dignity or sincerity. Finding a loss of interest in his books, a loss of beauty in the silver he, not too vehemently, collects. I imagine him wandering into that dainty little bedroom of his and around into the dressing-room, and there, wrapped in a blank contemplation of the 27 pairs of trousers, all creasing neatly in their proper stretches, that are necessary to his conception of a wise and happy man. For every occasion he has learnt, in a natural easy progress to knowledge, the exquisitely appropriate pair of trousers the permissible upper garment, the becoming gesture and word. He was a man who had mastered his world. And then, the whisper, "There are better dreams." What dreams? I imagine him asking, with a defensive note. Whatever transparence the world might have had, whatever suggestion of something beyond there, in the sea garden at Sandgate, I fancy that in Melville's apartments in London it was indisputably opaque. "And, damn it," he cried, "if these dreams are for Chatteris, why should she tell me? Suppose I had the chance of them, whatever they are?" He reflected, with a terrible sincerity in the nature of his will. "No!" And then again, "No!" And if one mustn't have 'em, why should one know about 'em and be worried by them? If she comes to do mischief, why shouldn't she do mischief without making me an accomplice? He walks up and down and stops at last and stares out of his window on the jaded summer traffic going Haymarket way. He sees nothing of that traffic. He sees the little sea garden at Sandgate, and that little group of people, very small and bright, and something hanging over them. It isn't fair on them, or me, or anybody. Then, quite suddenly I imagine him swearing. I imagine him at his luncheon, a meal he usually treats with a becoming gravity. I imagine the waiter marking the kindly self-indulgence of his clean-shaven face, and advancing with that air of intimate participation the good waiter shows to such as he esteems. I figure the respectful pause, the respectful enquiry. "Oh, anything!" cries Melville, and the waiter retires, amazed. End of Chapter 6, Part 2. Read by Tony Foster.
Sea Lady by H. G. Wells. Chapter 6, Symptomatic, Part 3. To add to Melville's distress, as petty discomforts to add to all genuine trouble, his clubhouse was undergoing an operation, and was full of builders and decorators. They had gouged out its windows, and gagged its halls with scaffolding, and he and his like were guests of a stranger club that had several members who blew. They seemed never to do anything but blow and sigh, and rustle papers and go to sleep about the place. They were like blight spots on the handsome plant of this host club, and it counted for little with Melville, in the state he was in, that all the fidgety breathers were persons of eminent position. But it was this temporary dislocation of his world that brought him unexpectedly into a quasi-confidential talk with Chatteris one afternoon. For Chatteris was one of the less eminent and amorphous members of this club that was sheltering Melville's club. Melville had taken up punch. He was in that mood when a man takes up anything, and was reading. He did not know exactly what. Presently he sighed, looked up, and discovered Chatteris entering the room. He was surprised to see Chatteris, startled and just faintly alarmed, and Chatteris, it was evident, was surprised and disconcerted to see him. Chatteris stood in as awkward an attitude as he was capable of, staring unfavorably, and for a moment or so he gave no sign of recognition. Then he nodded and came forward reluctantly. His every movement suggested the will without the wit to escape. "You here?" he said. "What are you doing away from Hythe at this time?" asked Melville. "I came here to write a letter," said Chatteris. He looked about him rather helplessly. Then he sat down beside Melville and demanded a cigarette. Suddenly he plunged into intimacy. "It is doubtful whether I shall contest Hythe," he remarked. "Yes?" "Yes." He lit his cigarette. "Would you?" he asked. "Not a bit of it," said Melville. "But then it's not my line." "Is it mine? Isn't it a little late in the day to drop it?" said Melville. "You've been put up for it now. Everyone's at work. Miss Glendower—" "I know," said Chatteris. "Well?" "I don't seem to want to go on." "My dear man, it's a bit of overwork perhaps. I'm off color. Things have gone flat. That's why I'm up here. He did a very absurd thing. He threw away a quarter-smoked cigarette and almost immediately demanded another. "You've been a little immoderate with your statistics," said Melville. Chatteris said something that struck Melville as having somehow been said before. Election, progress, good of humanity, public spirit. None of these things interest me really, he said. At least, not just now. Melville waited. One gets brought up in an atmosphere in which it's always being whispered that one should go for a career. You learn it at your mother's knee. They never give you time to find out what you really want. They keep on shoving you at that. They form your character. They rule your mind. They rush you into it. "They didn't rush me," said Melville. "They rushed me anyhow, and here I am." "You don't want a career? Well, look what it is." "Oh, if you look at what things are. First of all, the messing about to get into the house. These confounded parties mean nothing. Absolutely nothing. They aren't even decent factions. You blither to damned committees of damned tradesmen whose sole idea for this world is to get overpaid for their self-respect. You whisper and hobnob with the local solicitors and get yourself seen about with them. You ask about the charities and institutions, and lunch and chatter and chum with every conceivable form of human conceit and pushfulness and trickery." He broke off. "It isn't as if they were up to anything. They're working in their way, just as you are working in your way. It's the same game with all of them. They chase a phantom gratification. They toil and quarrel and envy, night and day, in the perpetual attempt to persuade themselves in spite of everything that they are real and a success." He stopped and smoked. Melville was spiteful. "Yes," he admitted, "but I thought your little movement was to be something more than party politics and self-advancement." He left his sentence interrogatively incomplete. "The condition of the poor," he said. "Well?" said Chatteris, regarding him with a sort of stony admission in his blue eyes. Melville dodged the look. "At Sandsgate," he said, "there was, you know, a certain atmosphere of belief." "I know," said Chatteris for the second time. "That's the devil of it," said Chatteris after a pause. "If I don't believe in the game I'm playing, if I'm left high and dry on this shoal, with the tide of belief gone past me, it isn't my planning anyhow. I know the decent thing I ought to do. I mean to do it. In the end, I mean to do it. I'm talking in this way to relieve my mind. I've started the game, and I must see it out. I've put my hand to the plow, and I mustn't go back. That's why I came to London. To get it over with myself. It was running up against you. Set me off. You caught me at the crisis." "Ah," said Melville, "but for all that, the thing is, as I said, none of these things interest me really. It won't alter the fact that I am committed to fight a phantom election about nothing in particular, for a party that's been dead 10 years. And if the ghosts win, go into the Parliament as a constituent spectre. There it is, as a mental phenomenon." He reiterated his cardinal article. "The interest is dead," he said. "The will has no soul." He became more critical. He bent a little closer to Melville's ear. "It isn't really that I don't believe. When I say I don't believe in these things, I go too far. I do. I know the electioneering, the intriguing is a means to an end. There is work to be done, sound work, and important work. Only," Melville turned an eye on him over his cigarette end. Chatteris met it. seemed for a moment to cling to it. He became absurdly confidential. He was evidently in the direst need of a confidential ear. I don't want to do it. When I sit down to it, square myself down in the chair, and say, now for the rest of my life, this is it. This is your life, Chatteris. There comes a sort of terror, Melville. Said Melville, and turned away. Then he turned on Chatteris with the air of a family physician, and tapped his shoulder 3 times as he spoke. You've had too much statistics, Chatteris, he said. He let that soak in. Then he turned about towards his interlocutor and toyed with a club ashtray. It's every day has overtaken you, he said. You can't see the wood for the trees. You forget the spacious design you are engaged upon, and the heavy details of the moment. You are like a painter who has been working hard upon something very small and exacting in a corner. You want to step back and look at the whole thing. No, said Chatteris. That isn't quite it. Melville indicated that he knew better. I keep on, stepping back and looking at it, said Chatteris. Just lately, I've scarcely done anything else. I'll admit it's a spacious and noble thing. Political work done well. Only, I admire it, but it doesn't grip my imagination. That's where the trouble comes in. What does grip your imagination? Asked Melville. He was absolutely certain the sea lady had been talking this paralysis into Chatteris, and he wanted to see just how far she had gone. For example, he tested, are there, by any chance, other dreams? Chatteris gave no sign at the phrase. Melville dismissed his suspicion. What do you mean, other dreams? Asked Chatteris. Is there conceivably another way? Another sort of life? Some other aspect? It's out of the question, said Chatteris. He added, rather remarkably, Adeline's awfully good. My cousin Melville acquiesced silently in Adeline's goodness. All this, is a mood. My life is made for me, and it's a very good life. It's better than I deserve. Heaps, said Melville. Much, said Chatteris defiantly. Ever so much, endorsed Melville. Let's talk of other things, said Chatteris. It's what even the street boys call morbid, nowadays, to doubt for a moment the absolute final, all this and nothing else in the worldishness of whatever you happen to be doing. My cousin Melville, however, could think of no other sufficiently interesting topic. You left them all right at Sandgate? He asked, after a pause. Except little Bunting, Seedy? Been fishing. Of course. Breezes and the spring tides. And Miss Waters? Chatteris shot a suspicious glance at him. He affected the offhand style. She's quite well, he said. Looks just as charming as ever. She really means that canvassing? She's spoken of it again. She'll do a lot for you, said Melville, and left a fine, wide pause. Chatteris assumed the tone of a man who gossips. Who is this Miss Waters? He asked. A very charming person, said Melville, and said no more. Chatteris waited, and his pretense of airy gossip vanished. He became very much in earnest. Look here, he said. Who is this Miss Waters? How should I know? Prevaricated Melville. Well, you do know, and the others know. Who is she? Melville met his eyes. Won't they tell you? He asked. That's just it, said Chatteris. Why do you want to know? Why shouldn't I know? There's a sort of promise to keep it dark. Keep what dark? My cousin gestured. It can't be anything wrong. My cousin made no sign. She may have had experiences. My cousin reflected a moment on the possibilities of deep sea life. She has had them, he said. I don't care if she has. There came a pause. Look here, Melville, said Chatteris. I want to know this, unless it's a thing to be specially kept from me. I don't like being among a lot of people who treat me as an outsider. What is this something about Miss Waters? What does Miss Glendower say? Vague things. She doesn't like her, and she won't say why, and Mrs. Bunting goes about with discretion written all over her. And she herself looks at you, and that maid of hers looks. The thing's worrying me. Why don't you ask the lady herself? How can I, till I know what it is? Confound it! I'm asking you plainly enough. Well, said Melville, and at the moment he had really decided to tell Chatteris, but he hung upon the matter of presentation. He thought it in the moment to say, the truth is, she is a mermaid. Then, as instantly he perceived how incredible this would be, he always suspected Chatteris of a capacity for being continental and romantic. The man might fly out at him for saying such a thing of a lady. A dreadful doubt fell upon Melville, as you know. He had never seen that tale with his own eyes. In these surroundings there came to him such an incredulity of the sea lady as he had not felt even when first Mrs. Bunting told him of her. All about him was an atmosphere of solid reality, such as one can breathe only in a first-class London club. Everywhere ponderous armchairs met the eye. There were massive tables in abundance, and matchboxes of solid rock. The matches were of some specially large, heavy sort. On a ponderous, elephant-legged green baize table near at hand were several copies of the Times, the Current Punch, an inkpot of solid brass, and a paperweight of lead. There are other dreams. It seemed impossible. The breathing of an eminent person in a chair in the far corner became very distinct in that interval. It was heavy and resolute, like the sound of a stonemason's saw. It insisted upon itself as the touchstone of reality. It seemed to say that at the first whisper of a thing so utterly improbable as a mermaid, it would snort and choke. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, said Melville. Well, tell me anyhow. My cousin looked at an empty chair beside him. It was evidently stuffed with the very best horsehair that money could procure, stuffed with infinite skill and an almost religious care. It preached in the open invitation of its expanded arms that man does not live by bread alone, inasmuch as afterwards he needs a nap. An utterly dreamless chair. Mermaids. He felt that he was after all quite possibly the victim of a foolish delusion, hypnotized by Mrs. Bunting's beliefs. Was there not some more plausible interpretation, some phrase that would lie out bridgeways from the plausible to the truth? It's no good, he groaned at last. Chatteris had been watching him furtively. Oh, I don't care a hang, he said, and shied his second cigarette into the massively decorated fireplace. It's no affair of mine. Then quite abruptly he sprang to his feet and gesticulated with an ineffectual hand. You needn't, he said, and seemed to intend to say many regrettable things. Meanwhile, until his intention ripened, he sawed the air with his ineffectual hand. I fancy he ended by failing to find a thing sufficiently regrettable to express the pungency of the moment. He flung about and went towards the door. Don't, he said to the back of the newspaper of the breathing member. If you don't want to, he said to the respectful waiter at the door. The hall porter heard that he didn't care. He was damned if he did. He might be one of these here guests, said the hall porter, greatly shocked. That's what comes of letting 'em in so young. Melville overcame an impulse to follow him. Confound the fellow, said he. And then, as the whole outburst came into focus, he said with still more emphasis, Confound the fellow. He stood up and became aware that the member who had been asleep was now regarding him with malevolent eyes. He perceived it was a hard and invincible malevolence, and that no petty apologetics of demeanor could avail against it. He turned about and went towards the door. The interview had done my cousin good. His misery and distress had lifted. He was presently bathed in a profound moral indignation, and that is the very antithesis of doubt and unhappiness. The more he thought it over, the more his indignation with Chatteris grew. That sudden unreasonable outbreak altered all the perspectives of the case. He wished very much that he could meet Chatteris again and discuss the whole matter from a new footing. Think of it! He thought so vividly and so verbally that he was nearly talking to himself as he went along. It shaped itself into an outspoken discourse in his mind. Was there ever a more ungracious, ungrateful, unreasonable creature than this same Chatteris? He was the spoiled child of fortune. Things came to him, things were given to him. His very blunders brought more to him than other men's successes. Out of every 1,000 men, 999 might well find food for envy in this way luck had served him. Many a one has toiled all his life and taken at last gratefully the merest fraction of all that had thrust itself upon this insatiable, thankless young man. Even I, thought my cousin, might envy him, in several ways. And then, at the mere first onset of duty, nay, at the mere first whisper of restraint, this insubordination, this protest and flight. Think, urged my cousin, of the common lot of men. Think of the many who suffer from hunger. It was a painful socialistic sort of line to take, but in his mood and moral indignation, my cousin pursued it relentlessly. Think of many who suffer from hunger, who lead lives of unremitting toil, who go fearful, who go squalid, and withal strive, in a sort of dumb, resolute way, their utmost to do their duty, or at any rate what they think to be their duty. Think of the chaste poor women in the world. Think again of the many honest souls who aspire to the service of their kind, and are so hemmed about and preoccupied that they may not give it. And then this pitiful creature comes, with his mental gifts, his gifts of position and opportunity, the stimulus of great ideas, and a fiancée, who is not only rich and beautiful, she is beautiful, but also the best of all possible helpers for him, and he turns away. It isn't good enough. It takes no hold upon his imagination, if you please. It isn't beautiful enough for him, and that's the plain truth of the matter. What does the man want? What does he expect? My cousin's moral indignation took him the whole length of Piccadilly, and along by Rotten Row, and along the flowery garden walks, almost into Kensington High Street, and so around by the Serpentine to his home, and it gave him such an appetite for dinner as he had not had for many days. Life was bright for him all that evening, and he sat down at last, at 2 o'clock in the morning, before a needlessly lit, delightfully fusilating fire in his flat to smoke one sound cigar before he went to bed. "No," he said suddenly. "I am not morbid either. I take the gifts the gods will give me. I try to make myself happy, and a few other people happy, too, to do a few little duties decently, and that is enough for me. I don't look too deeply into things, and I don't look too widely about things. A few old simple ideals. Chatteris is a dreamer, with an impossible, extravagant discontent. What does he dream of? 3 parts he is a dreamer, and the 4th part, spoiled child, dreamer. Other dreams. What other dreams could she mean? My cousin fell into profound musings. Then he started, looked about him, saw the time by his Rathbone clock, got up suddenly, and went to bed. End of chapter 6, part 3. Recording by Jairus Amar.